following video contains major spoilers for the first Alan Wake game, including its ending, and minor spoilers for The Stand and The Dark Tower by Stephen King. You have been warned. Though he isn't the only person to write them, the subject of stories about writers and their works pretty quickly leads us to Stephen King. Even leaving aside The Dark Half, where author Thad Beaumont's pen name George Stark comes to life to haunt his alter ego, and the Dark Tower series where King himself makes an appearance as the writer of the world through which Roland the Chain travels, many of his other novels' protagonists are themselves novelists. Jack Torrance in The Shining, Ben Mears in Salem's Lot, Bill Denborough in It, Paul Sheldon in Misery, and more. In King's stories, the character being a writer is inextricably tied to the horror of the story, whether that horror comes through the manifestation of fiction as reality, writer's block-driven madness and haunting, or obsessive fandom. These themes, of course, are reflective of King's own life and struggles. He's been open about the alcoholism and drug use that fueled much of his earlier writing, and contribute to a very particular, perhaps tropey, take on what it means to be a writer, haunted by his own genius, and stalked by the threat of writer's block, the only thing worse than the obsession of the most extreme fans. It's in this context that Alan Wake, the eponymous protagonist of the 2010 game from Remedy Entertainment and its long-awaited sequel in 2023, is very clearly inspired by King and his conception of the tortured novelist. That the story begins with Wake trying to escape his writer's block, and culminates in his creations coming to life, his writing both the cause of and solution to the existential threats to both his family and the small town of Bright Falls, Washington, only underlines the Kingness of the narrative. The dark, mysterious and threatening aura of the dark place stands in sharp contrast to the bizarre and surreal nature of many characters, but in a way that feels authentic. Remedy has a talent for recognising that people, generally, are weird, and that true horror is tinged with the absurd. Whilst this is more apparent in the sequel, the blueprints for it are clear here in the original. When Alan Wake first released in 2010, it completely passed me by. In fact, I played it for the very first time the night before its sequel released, in a single sitting that kept me up till 3 AM. Alan Wake 2 was my personal game of the year for 2023, and I explained why in my full review of that game. Unfortunately, the first game didn't win me over as decisively, but whilst the gameplay definitely felt lacking, it was the story that kept me going. It's not a bad game, by any means, but it does feel very much of its time in a lot of ways. However, with that said, I have to give credit that at least the remaster which I played still looks extremely good. The graphics are serviceable, elevated by an art direction which makes every moment in the darkness feel suitably oppressive, and presents the light accordingly as a beacon of safety. And whilst the live action inserts are nowhere on the level of the truly sublime moments that we got in the sequel, they're still used very effectively to give a sense of dreamlike unreality as we untangle what exactly is going on. Speaking of which, the story sees best-selling novelist Alan Wake travelling to the town of Bright Falls with his wife Alice, hoping that the break will be rejuvenating for them both. However, it soon becomes clear that something is off in this quaint little town. Before we get there, Wake narrates for us a recurring dream that he has. In this dream, which serves both as a tutorial for the gameplay mechanics and as a prophetic dream for Wake, foreshadowing everything to come, he hits a hitchhiker with his car on a dark highway, only for the hitchhiker to vanish and pursue Wake. The threat presented by the hitchhiker quickly becomes greater than that of a single man, embodying the darkness itself, with only light able to burn away the threat and a nearby lighthouse presented as the ultimate goal for safety. Until he reaches it and the lights go out. It's not my intention in this video to compare every aspect of Alan Wake to Stephen King's writing, but I will say here that there are distinct echoes of one of King's greatest works, The Stand. The enigmatic dream which tells of light and darkness, with the lighthouse as a beacon against the dark presence, mirrors the characters of Mother Abigail and the Dark Man. And in The Stand, of course, whilst the light of Mother Abigail appears as a beacon of safety, the protagonists must ultimately leave it behind and come face to face with the Dark Man to see events through. Another story coming to life, although in this case one where the writer is God or Providence, and one which repeats itself across realities once you explore King's multiverse through the Dark Tower. though we don't really see this aspect of things coming into play until Alan Wake 2. Wake's wife, Alice, wakes him from the nightmare, and we see they're approaching Bright Falls by ferry. Once in town, Wake goes into the Oh Dear Diner, where he is due to collect the cabin keys from Carl Stuckey. Here, we get our first glimpse at some of the colourful cast of characters that populate Bright Falls. A cutout of Wake advertising his latest book stands at the diner door because waitress Rose is his #1 fan. As obsessive, perhaps, as Annie Wilkes, though in this case far more friendly and wholesome. The Anderson brothers, of the band Old Gods of Asgard, have escaped from the local mental institution for artists and are reminiscing about their glory days. That there is enough of a demand for Bright Falls to specifically have a mental institution focused on artists is something we will return to. And Cynthia Weaver, clutching a lantern tightly, stands outside the dark corridor leading to the bathrooms, where Carl Stuckey is currently to be found, and warns Wake against going into the shadows. Wake ignores the warning, of course, and goes to the bathroom. But instead of Stuckey, he finds an old woman in a black dress and veil, who provides the keys to the cabin on Diver's Isle in the middle of Cauldron Lake. When Wake returns to Alice in the car, neither of them see Stuckey emerge from the diner, yelling that they forgot their key. At the cabin, Alice surprises Wake with a typewriter, and the news that she has gotten him an appointment with psychiatrist Emil Hartman to help him with his writer's block. Wake is furious at this news, having wanted to escape from all thoughts of writing and his career whilst away, and he storms out of the house. This is when the power goes out, and Alice, who has a debilitating fear of the dark, starts screaming for help. Wake runs back to her, where he sees her fall into the lake. He dives after her, only to then wake up in his car, bleeding and crashed at the edge of a cliff. With no memory of the intervening time, Wake makes his way through the woods towards the gas station in search of help. Along the way, he finds the manuscript pages for a novel called Departure, which he has no memory of writing, and is attacked by Carl Stuckey, who has been taken by the dark presence. Throughout the game, with flashlight and gun, Wake will need to battle many such taken to reach his goals. When he finally gets to the gas station and reaches the police for help, he encounters the skeptical sheriff Sarah Breaker, who tells him that the cabin he was staying at sunk with Diver's Isle during a volcanic eruption in the 1970s. Wake sees this for himself, as well as learning that it's been a week since he dived from the apparently non-existent isle into the lake after Alice. Over the course of 6 chapters, the game reveals that Cauldron Lake is an entry point to a world beyond our own called the Dark Place. The Dark Place has a special power over Bright Falls and the art created there, which brings it to life, and is dominated by the Dark Presence, who is determined to use Wake's writing in order to grow stronger and escape into our world. Wake's missing week was spent writing Departure at the behest of the Dark Presence, believing that it would bring Alice back, until, realizing the lie, he escaped by writing himself into the story. The power of art and the toll it takes on the artists are intertwined themes that recur all through the story. Cauldron Lake Lodge, the aforementioned mental institution for artists, is a major manifestation of this, theoretically existing to help artists rediscover their creativity, but in the story taking on a sinister edge as Emil Hartman gaslights Wake in an attempt to get him to complete Departure and use the power of the Dark Place for his own ends. Only the Old Gods of Asgard, embracing their own insanity rather than trying to cure themselves, have any real handle on what is going on, and are able to help Wake escape in turn. In the real world, art and creativity can be extremely therapeutic both in general and specifically as a form of therapy, so it's always somewhat bizarre in fiction, especially horror, to see it portrayed as harmful. Something that leads into vice and a toxic feedback loop of impossible expectations, the demands of fame, self-destruction, and the knock-on impact of those around the artists. Whilst this might be specifically relatable for famous artists, such as King, or for the likes of Van Gogh struggling against poverty and derision whilst in life, much of fiction has elevated this to a universal experience when that's by no means the case. Alan Wake leans into those same tropes, but this is at least balanced by the fact that in the end the key to fixing things is not to forsake his writing, but to do it honestly and for himself rather than to serve the ends of others. The need for the story to fit the genre and how it plays out to feel honest and natural in order to work also gives more credit to writing as a craft than we might see in other stories where writers simply make horrible things happen through their typewriters. Wake also learns that he isn't the first writer caught in this same situation, as in the 1930s Thomas Zane faced a similar struggle. For Zane, the only way to stop the dark presence was to write himself out of the real world so that his fame as a writer is erased. And in learning from this, Wake discovers that instead he needs to write himself as winning. Though because he is writing a horror story, this takes the form of sacrificing himself for Alice, rather than a happy ending. Still, while being true to the genre, we have the notion of the writer whose creativity offers harm in the Stephen King mold, versus an inversion of that, where the writer's creativity is the only way out of the harm. Tied into Thomas Zane's story is Cynthia Weaver, whose unrequited love for him sees her carrying a torch, quite literally, for the rest of her life. She builds a safe haven in the light that the dark place and dark presence cannot touch. Within that, one room which she has kept lit for decades, since it holds the key to Wake's victory: the clicker. A light switch that Wake's mother gave him as a child, telling him it would keep the darkness away. Wake later gives Alice the clicker as a way to deal with her own debilitating fear of the dark. It turns out to have been written by Zane as the key to Wake's fiction defeating the dark presence. In this, we see fiction and reality not just overlapping, the latter shaped by the former, not just in the immediate events of Bright Falls, but on a far wider scope, and for far longer. The questions this raises about what is and isn't real, and where it started, can't fully be answered, because those answers would inevitably be unsatisfying. But instead, like Wake, all we can do is wonder.
Stephen King once wrote that nightmares exist outside of logic, and there's little fun to be had in explanations. They're antithetical to the poetry of fear.
On the way to the finale, we also see Rose's fandom of Wake exploited by the dark place as it takes over her, using her to lead him to its own ends. But she is still never truly dangerous. Instead, that threatening, obsessive archetype is embodied by FBI agent Robert Nightingale, who pursues Wake on suspicion of murdering Alice, but in doing so goes beyond all sense of reason. Why he was there in the first place is already a question to raise eyebrows, but his utterly unhinged actions push Sheriff Breaker to trust Wake.
Agent Nightingale, your opinion would matter more if you were sober and if I actually believed you were here on official business.
And she helps him in his final plan to defeat the Dark Place, after it unceremoniously snatches up Nightingale as he reads his own fate from a page of Wake's manuscript. Finally, Wake dives into the lake and uses the clicker to make his finished version of Departure come true. The town is restored, and Alice is released from the lake, but in their place, Wake is trapped in the Dark Place. There is still much left unanswered, with the threat of a doppelganger of Wake called Mr. Scratch, and the final cliffhanger line of Departure.
It's not a lake. It's an ocean.
The story appears straightforward in a sense, having an ending that could have served as a satisfying sign-off had there not been a sequel, and yet the mysteries presented demand further exploration. It wears not only its Stephen King influences, but also its inspiration from Twin Peaks and the Twilight Zone, as featured in the in-game TV show Night Springs, on its sleeve, and has used them in the writing to create something that feels original, enigmatic, and thoroughly captivating. The score is suitably atmospheric, the sound design reflects the ethereal nature of events, and the voice performances perfectly capture the spookiness and goofiness alike, with the episodic presentation making this experience feel like something you might get on prestige TV. Unfortunately, whereas in the sequel this is complemented by slow burn survival horror gameplay, here we get some admittedly intriguing mechanics which sadly become repetitive fast and don't really gel with the kind of story being told. The combat in Alan Wake consists of using light to make the enemies vulnerable, then shooting them until they die. Your flashlight will slowly burn the darkness out of enemies at all times, but do so much faster when focused, though this uses charge which must be replenished with batteries. Streetlights serve as save points, despawning the enemies while you're inside, sometimes serving as barriers to prevent them travelling further into the level, and replenishing your health and the current battery on your flashlight. Both of these things slowly recharge when you aren't taking damage anyway, but the process is faster in the light. In and of itself, this system isn't necessarily bad. However, there's little enemy variety, and the game is fond of compensating for this by simply giving you lots of them. Whilst you can dodge, The environment isn't always conducive to fighting larger groups, as you'll quickly find yourself dodging into a corner where you can get stun locked, or wrestling with a control system which is definitely very clunky by comparison to the same mechanics in the sequel. The game also appears unable to make up its mind whether combat is always necessary. It advises you to run away on occasion to save resources, and the resources provided do make that necessary, but the enemies are nearly always faster than Wake, thwarting attempts to flee, especially when the sprint and dodge being on the same button conflict with each other, and you struggle to gain the speed you need. Of course, Alan Wake is 13 years old, so can be forgiven some jankiness on that basis. My point is only that in terms of controls and combat, it feels very much of its time. The repetitive nature of combat and the frustration of some areas as you wrestle with the controls and enemy numbers only makes how dated it all feels more apparent. It's not all bad. The scripted set pieces at certain moments, such as big chases and boss fights, can be a lot of fun and feed into the epic feel of the narrative. And even the more general combat, despite the repetitive and occasionally frustrating nature of it, is serviceable rather than outright terrible. But on the whole, as I mentioned, it's the story rather than the gameplay which will keep you going. It's definitely worth it on that front if you choose to play it before experiencing Alan Wake 2. You'll be better placed to recognise callbacks between the two games, and certain characters' stories in the sequel are elevated by the knowledge of who they are and where they come from in the original. It also compounds the tragedy in some cases, to see what might class as a happy ending for some, as the first game comes to a close, be pulled into tragedy by the events of the second. I'm deliberately not naming names on that front, so as not to spoil the second game in particular. But if you're paying attention in the first game, then certain moments in the second are absolutely heartbreaking. Alan Wake is rightly regarded as a classic game, but it's one that's very much dated when it comes to gameplay. However, its story remains hugely compelling both in its own right and as a prelude to the absolute masterpiece that is Alan Wake 2. It's for that reason that I would recommend playing it, because whilst the story video might give you the necessary background for the sequel, there's something to be said for seeing a narrative unfold for yourself rather than simply watching a summary. Have you played the original Alan Wake? Did you enjoy it or did you not rate it? How would you compare it to its sequel? Let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, then please give it a like and consider subscribing to keep up to date with all my content. Like the video that just popped up, which YouTube thinks you should watch next. This is a Patreon and member supported channel, so if you want to become a member and unlock custom badges and emojis, early access to my videos, and your name in the credits, then click the join button below. Thanks very much for watching, and see you next time.